time, we take another quick look at the graphics card market and just how jacked up it is as of late. Of course, with the holidays approaching, things are just in higher and higher demand, and when you have such a supply shortage as the one we're experiencing, it just compounds the issue. Prices continue to go up. We did experience a bit of a price drop around August or so, and we documented that in the previous video to this kind of mini series. I have it linked in the video description if you want to check it out. But now things are starting to ramp back up. Do any graphics card deals exist at all in late 2021? We're gonna try to sort of figure that out with some math and statistics. Stay with me. LG tone-free earbuds blend comfort, cleanliness, and crisp sound with active noise cancellation. The case sports a unique UV nano feature designed to kill 99.9% of bacteria on the speaker mesh, and it only requires 5 minutes of UV exposure to work its magic. Tone earbuds also utilize a medical-grade hypoallergenic ear gel for reduced skin irritation and optimal comfort. And of course, enjoy clear and spatial sound fine-tuned by Meridian for up to 24 hours with the aid of case charging. And at that, just 5 minutes of charging alone will give you an hour of playtime. You can even use the Tone app to sync up various modes to both noisy and quiet situations, ensuring call quality isn't compromised. And if you need to connect to an aux port, LG's plug-in wireless feature lets you connect where wireless alone otherwise wouldn't. Learn more about LG Tone earbuds via the link below. Now, in our original graphics card market analysis video, which I suppose I'll also have linked in the description, it wouldn't make sense to link part 2 without part 1, we talk about how we arrived at these numbers. So you'll see score, you'll see ESP, MSRP. Obviously MSRP is pretty straightforward, but score and ESP, you have to have some context there, and that's what I'm going to show you now. So this is where it all started. 64 or so graphics cards, all accompanied with scores and of course MSRP and a calculated value. Now these scores were derived from a 3D Marks database for TimeSpy graphics scores that have been archived there. This can be easily found by hopping over to that database and typing whatever graphics card you want. These scores have probably changed a bit, of course, as drivers mature and the like. I don't expect them to change drastically, but there will be small variances here and there. It just depends on when this data is pulled. I pulled all of this around, I think it was February or March of this year. So again, yeah, these numbers might be slightly different now, but for all intents and purposes, this is how each of these cards stacks up in that database. And then obviously this is only a single benchmark we're taking into account here, so it's likely some cards will surpass others and other benchmarks, etc. Just take all this with a grain of salt. It still helps us compile all of the data. Now this next column doesn't need too much in the way of explanation. Manufacturer suggested retail price. This is what the manufacturers themselves say these cards should be selling for. They're not really set in stone prices, but they are, again, recommended. And this last column here is value. This is simply the quotient of score and MSRP, which gives us a performance per dollar metric. Each of these is weighted against each other, by the way, which is why you see the conditional formatting here. So the ones in green are the better values, at least at MSRP, and the ones in red are pretty awful values. Obviously, the Titan V or Titan 5, whatever you want to call it, that is a very low value. It's a very expensive card, and you get worse performance on average than a 3070, at least according to the TimeSpy database. So that makes it a terrible value by comparison. This obviously favors more recent cards as well. So cards that are older will tend to score worse on this chart because, you know, older technology and you're paying more back in the day, but back in the day, this was the best you could get. So it made a bit more sense then, but it wouldn't really make much sense to buy a Titan now for $1,000 when, heck, an R9 380X will give you the same performance more or less for 1/5 the cost. So that in a nutshell is how the Excel spreadsheet is laid out. It does get a bit dicier when we factor in mean and standard deviation, which are statistics terms, and it's not super complicated, so I will briefly explain it, but what you need to know if you're just looking for like a meat and potatoes kind of like TLDR is that we're taking 3D Mark TimeSpy scores and we're juxtaposing those with prices. Now the price point is variable because obviously none of these cards are selling at MSRP in late 2021, and that's where ESP comes into play. So this data set here was gathered April of 2021. This is what we used in the original video where we talked about the difference between MSRP and ESP and how that affected the value of each of these SKUs. This ESP, again, was derived from the most recent, at the time of taking in this data, 10 sales of legit graphics cards for each SKU. I obviously omitted cards that were for parts or not working because that'll skew the prices down. I also omitted the prices for like shrouds of cards. So maybe you had like 3060 Ti in the title, but you were just selling the fan shroud because you replaced the shroud with like a water block or whatever. So those sales were excluded. To outliers are always going to drag the mean one way or the other. And we take the most recent 10 legitimate graphics card sales, average those together, and then replace MSRP with that value. That's what I'm calling ESP. It's not foolproof. It's not 100% accurate. Nothing in this business really is. If you're in statistics, it's more about like trying to approach as accurate a figure as you can, and that's based on the amount of data that you intake. I'm doing all this by hand for the most part. I have a few scripts running in the background, but most of it's by hand, so I just can't take in 100 cards and then come to an ESP value from that. It's not really possible. So this was April's data. Again, tons of it. Some of the worst cards, the GT710. We've also got, let's see, the 3090 is a pretty terrible card, GT1030. You notice that a lot of the very weak cards and a lot of the very powerful cards you're paying premiums for. This more or less because you're still paying for parts, shipping, the box, etc. Even though the GPU itself is weak, there's still a lot of manufacturing that goes into it, and that overhead gets tacked onto the resulting price. And then the RTX 3090 and cards like it, I mean, they're the best of the best. If you want the best of the best, you got to pay up. Now, around August 2021, we updated ESPs, and I noticed that prices pretty much across the board had dropped. The percentage by which they dropped, I mean, it was around, if I recall, 20 to 30%. We can just look at the 3060 Ti here. So that was $950 in August, and in April, that was selling for $1,300 on average. That's a pretty substantial decrease in price. You can see the resulting value also went up. Of course it would, because it's simply a quotient. So from 9 or so to about 12.5. This was good news. A lot of people thought that things were heading in the right direction, but I unfortunately have some bad news to share with you, and I'm not sure if this is just circumstantial around the holiday season or if this has a lot to do with inflation and other things that are starting to take hold as well, because around August there were fears that inflation was going to start ramping costs up across the board, and of course things that are already in short supply are going to be hit heavily by that, and I think that's exactly what we're seeing here. Now this is November 2021 data, and with few exceptions, things across the board have returned to at least what they were in April, probably a bit higher than that. I'd have to go back and compare all three, but we can do, and we'll do this at the end of the video. We'll compare April to August to November and see how prices have changed for each SKU over time. The 3060 Ti is one of the only cards that I can recall that went down in price, at least on average, the most recent 10 that I took into account. This is going to be somewhat SKU dependent. Obviously, there are more expensive and less expensive 3060 Ti, so if it just so happens that the most recent 10 I took contain largely, cheaper SKUs, okay, that might affect ESP a bit, but we don't expect this to sway numbers to a huge amount, right? Where we were selling these, let's see, in April, I think they were selling for $1,300, right? So $1,300 there. I mean, it doesn't matter how many SKUs or how many cheap SKUs you throw into that top 10 or most recent 10 mix, you're not going to get this kind of swing. So from 950 to 900, I mean, that's not substantial, but in the context of every other price point here, this is one of the few SKUs that really hasn't gone up in price, and the value reflects it's about 13. Now the 1650 Super, selling for about $300 on average on eBay, is actually pretty decent. 15.6. I mean, that's comparatively. I mean, look at all these other scores here. It's one of the better ones. It is one of the weaker cards, and you'll find that that's a pretty common trend here as well. Also, you need to remember that this value here is 100% relational to every other value in this chart. So just because a 1650 Super has a decent value compared to, say, a 3070, that doesn't mean that the 1650 Super is a good deal. It just means with respect to the 3070, it is a better deal. These ones that are conditionally formatted in green tend to be on the positive side in terms of value, but again, if you were comparing these prices to pre-COVID prices, pre-shortage prices, these are still pretty awful. So this only takes into account this snapshot in time when I gathered all of this data again in early November. Now I'm going to show you a few graphs that will make all of this info a bit more palatable, because it can be a bit overwhelming just looking at a bunch of numbers and things on an Excel spreadsheet. I get it. I do this virtually for a living, and I still hate staring at just numbers on a screen. So this is a scatter plot of graphics card value against raw score, and you can see that there's a positive trend line here. I actually get my Let me move my camera box out of the way. So you can see this here is our trend line. It's a positive trend line, and it suggests that as the score of a card increases, the value of that card also increases, which means you get a little more bang for your buck with these higher end cards, right? So an RTX 3070, that's a really high scoring card, but also a great value card by comparison. You see it scores up here around 27, 28. Again, at MSRP, of course, that's not the case now. So take a mental snapshot of this, and we're going to compare it to April 2021 prices. Look at that. Look at how substantial that difference is. Now, I forgot to lock my y-axis, so things did end up shrinking a tad. You can see the maximum y value is 30 instead of 35. For all the other charts I'll show you, we keep it at 30. But yeah, this is, I mean, this is not good. So what this suggests here is that now there's a negative correlation between value and score, which means that the more expensive cards are also the higher performing ones, or vice versa. The higher performing cards are the more expensive ones. That's kind of the opposite of what you would expect, especially with the modern advancements in technology. You tend to get more value in newer generation tech. But because these are in such high demand, again, you have tons of people mining with these cards. People just are trying to get a hold of them, scalp them, flip them, whatever. There aren't many of them, and that's driven prices in the third-party markets up. Now, things got better in August, so check this out. Again, the y-axis is locked this time. You can see how that entire trend line shifted upward. This suggests that prices across the board decrease. It's the only way for the values of each of these cards to increase because the score is fixed. Remember, we're not updating the TimeSpy scores in between each of these snapshots. So you can see that the Radeon 7 here, for example, right, that score is roughly 8,000 or so. And between August and April, that score is the same. It's baked in here. You can't really see it because it's covered by a bunch of other info, but it is still the same in the same location along the x-axis is what I'm trying to say. You could look at, let's look at the 3090. So that's just below 20,000. And if we jump to August, you can see it's still below 20,000. So it's not moving. None of these points are moving along the x-axis, but they are moving along the y-axis. And the only other variable is price, which means that the prices for these had to decrease between April and August. And again, there are a few exceptions, like the GT710 down here, that really didn't change much in price, but this was already pretty much bottomed out. You can't really get GT710s for any cheaper than this without taking a pretty heavy loss, just because, again, the amount of labor, the parts, and the just raw materials that go into cards like these, there's a pretty horrible value proposition there. But if you absolutely need something for picture out in cases where like Ryzen CPUs or whatever don't have integrated graphics, you need something like this, a bare bones GT710 will do. Now, for the November 2021 data, check this out. Again, a locked y-axis, everything shifts back down. It's honestly pretty disappointing. You can see especially some of these newer cards over here, the 2080 Ti, the 3070, 3080, 3090, most of these shifted down in November. And again, the only thing that could cause this shift downward is an increase in price. So prices, yes, have very clearly risen. Again, the degree to which it's around 20 to 25%. According to, again, my calculations, and take these with a grain of salt because we're only factoring in the most recent 10 sale prices for each of these SKUs, but still, I think that this evidence is fairly overwhelming. Now, I'm going to take a quick minute away from the doom and gloom in this one to talk about something much more positive, that being the sponsor in this video, LG. I know we've already seen the pre-roll, but I do want to shed a bit of light into what goes on behind the scenes in these videos. These videos take so long to produce. They really do. And as a one-man operation, compiling 64 graphics cards worth of data in a single video takes several days. I mean, there's just no way around it. And it's thanks to sponsors like LG that I'm able to do this with a clear head, because I know that in the downtime, I'm still going to be supported by these great brands. I've been using these tone-free earbuds for a very long time. It's not like they just sent these to me randomly and they're like, hey, just go promote this. You know, it's something I've never used before. I use these when I mow the lawn. I use these when I travel, especially via air. They are so compact. I really like the case. You get extra charges in the case. You get the UV nano protection. It's the best of pretty much everything in this price range, and that's why I want you guys to at least check them out. Click the link below if you haven't already. If you can find a friend who already has a set and you want to test them out, I guarantee you won't be disappointed, especially for the price you'll be paying. Again, thanks to LG, this video is possible. Now here's something else a bit disappointing you can pull from the scatter plot that I didn't really think about when I was creating these charts. The fact that there aren't really any positive outliers, in the sense that there aren't many like Easter egg cards that are kind of sliding under the radar like there were in August and April. So you can see back in April there were a few graphics cards that stood way outside the standard value trend, those being the R9 3DX and the R9 Fury X. Now there were a few negative outliers as well, so these would fall maybe 2 or 3 standard deviations below the mean, but these two here, if I recall, fell about 3 standard deviations above the mean, which for us shoppers is a great thing. Now if you notice, the 380X here and the Fury X, these are both quite old AMD graphics cards. The Fury X is quite the power-hungry card, which is probably why it was such a good value at the time, because miners just didn't want these. They're no good for mining because at the end of the day, you're going to be spending way more on your power bill than you would a comparable performing card that's much newer, that's much more efficient. Compare this to August, and you can see there were still a couple of cards that were performing exceptionally well. The R9 290, the GTX 960 kind of reared its head a bit. The R9 Fury, not the Fury X, but the plain old vanilla Fury was pretty good. I'd say 2 to 3 standard deviations above the mean. But then we get to November, and we have virtually none of that. There are no significant positive outliers. And that means that there's really nothing I can suggest to you that you buy right now if you're willing to buy a used card from a few generations ago. There's really nothing that stands out anymore. It's almost like people saw these videos we've been making and they went out and bought the cards that we were recommending, and now there aren't any of them for decent prices anymore. They're still available on eBay, but not for the kinds of prices or for the kinds of values we were expecting, at least based on, again, earlier data. So, yeah, April was great. The 380X and the Fury X were awesome. And, yeah, there were still a few cards, pretty good in August. And then, yeah, what happened here? Almost nothing within 2 standard deviations above the mean in November. That kind of sucks. So while at this point I'd normally be telling you, hey, there's this one graphics card that's really standing out as a decent deal right now, what that means is there's really not a card out there that I could tell you is worth buying or that stands out from the competition with respect to value anymore. Like the R9 Fury is still pretty good. The GTX 780 is pretty good. The GTX 980 is okay. The RX 460 is okay, but they're not exceptional. And because these cards, by and large, are so old and not very powerful, relatively speaking, it just doesn't really make it worth it. If I had to buy a card right now and I wanted to game in 1080p, I'd probably buy an R9 Fury, but I would have felt a lot better about buying that R9 Fury back in August. At this point in November, not worth it. This chart here takes our 3 snapshots in time, obviously April, August, and November, and shows how that value has changed over that period of time. Most of these cards have a white trend line, and this is because they're irrelevant. All of them, for the most part, were at their peak in around August and went back down in November. They're no good. A couple of exceptions, the 3060 Ti, one of those that has gone up slightly in value. It's still not a good value, relatively speaking, but it did go up. The RX 460, a much weaker card, substantially higher in value in November than August, but again, it's only at around 16 or 17 on that value chart, which is, by comparison, again, not super exceptional. And the GTX 980, another one that, well, it went up in August and it kind of flatlined in November, but still a general upward trend, although I'd like it to be a bit steeper. Not phenomenal, not a phenomenal value right now, definitely wasn't back in April, but those are really the only 3 outliers in terms of like shifts in the trends. Every other card, for the most part, either stayed the same or went down in value. So it really is a letdown. I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but our data suggests that it's not a great time at all to buy. Not that we should really be surprised, because again, with the holidays and the demand just skyrocketing even more than it has in the past, you know, it's you're fighting an uphill battle here. There are very clearly some cards to stay away from outright. You could make a case for a lot of these still if you really need something right now. I don't recommend you indulge your desires. If it's not something that you need, but just something you want, you can wait till after the holidays. I have no doubt these prices will come back down at least slightly after December. But until then, I mean, this is a minefield. I would not want to be in this market right now. I wouldn't want to be shopping for a graphics card in late 2021. Even these that are green, like the GTX 1650 Super, a value of 15 back in August was yellow. It was like borderline yellow green. It wasn't as good. It only looks better now because everything else around this point in time is just awful. Every other card at the snapshot is just awful. Like the 3080 is like, that's, well, who would pay $1,800 for this card? Oh, plenty of people are, but it's not worth that. Especially with respect to other cards in this chart, it's definitely not worth it. Heck, even some older cards like RX 5700s and 5700 XTs. I mean, these are awful scores. The RX 460, again, that's one of the few exceptions. Is one of the higher value scores on the chart, but 17 was not something to be proud of. Back in April and August, and 17 back in August was, it was light green. It still had a hint of yellow in it. So it wasn't phenomenal. Heck, what was really good in August was like a score of 25, 24. These are the ones to be looking after here. The R9 290, which obviously it's a very hot, very inefficient card, but still. And the R9 Fury. These cards for 150 and $200 were killer values. Again, with respect to other cards on this chart at this point in time, not compared to 2 years from now. Again, that's not what we're trying to do here. But 18 and 19, this is the best we've got. This is literally the best we can do in November. And so because of that, because the data is telling us this, I cannot recommend you really buy anything right now. It just doesn't make sense unless you absolutely need to build something right now for work or for streaming, or, if you can justify it from a business standpoint, fine. You probably can make it work, but I just, as a hobby, it really is depressing. Again, I really wish I had better news. I hate to be the bearer of bad news because people end up leaving this video feeling sour, feeling disappointed, and they don't, that's not my goal. I'm not trying to clickbait this or make this like a negative news article just for the sake of making it clicky. I don't need to do that. We have plenty of videos that do quite well and we can stay positive in those. But this is one of those where I feel like I owe it to you guys to at least divulge the information that I've collected because it's not looking too pretty. So if you were anticipating buying a card right now, unless you can find a local sale, maybe someone's trying to sell a car and they're just not aware of current market trends, right? Their ignorance is all the more power to you, right? I mean, you could say, oh, well, that's unethical. You're not being honest about what the card's actually worth or whatever. Like, look, they have just as much time to do their due diligence as you do. And if they didn't do their due diligence and someone else says, oh, you're ripping that guy off, well, he's happy with what he's selling it for. Otherwise, he or she wouldn't have sold it for that price, right? So that's where I think you can get lucky if you want to look locally for a graphics card. Although most, again, are probably going to be up to speed on how things are looking on eBay and elsewhere. You might get lucky with a pre-built. I know Costco is running a pretty okay deal on a few 3060 Ti builds and things. Like you can get like full-on Core i7 3060 Ti builds for like $1,300 or $1,400. Like that's not terrible, but I hate recommending a pre-built just for the sake of the card, because I know what people do. They take out the graphics cards and then they put them in their own builds, and then they turn around and sell the shells. They sell the remainder of the build minus the discrete card. It is what it is. I mean, if you feel like that's what you have to do, fine. It's not illegal. It's just annoying that it's all coming to this. I don't know. Again, I wish I had better news. I really do. If you guys want to leave a comment, please do that. Let me know what your take is on the current situation. Be sure to give the video a thumbs up if you appreciated the compiling of the data. If you thought that the presentation was cool, maybe a thumbs up for that. I hope you don't smash the dislike button just because of the news I'm bearing, but I understand that's how the internet sometimes works. If you haven't subscribed, get subscribed. I'm sure you'll enjoy several other videos we have coming up here on the channel. And yeah, stay tuned for more of this. My name is Greg. Thanks for learning with me.